I still remember the exact second my stomach dropped, not because something exploded or alarms went off, but because of silence, that weird, empty silence you get when something that's always there suddenly isn't. And I was standing barefoot in my driveway, coffee half finished, staring at a rectangle of concrete where a fully marked patrol car had been sitting just hours earlier. Lights, decals, radio, city seal and all, gone like it had never existed. And the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't anger or panic, it was confusion. This slow, creeping, no, that's not possible feeling, because nobody just accidentally makes a police car disappear. Let me rewind a bit, because this didn't start with a tow truck. It started with a woman who moved into our neighborhood and decided that the world worked differently for her than it did for everyone else. My name's not really Jack, but for the sake of this story, let's call me Jack. I'm a patrol officer with a mid-sized city police department on the East Coast. Been on the job over a decade, rotating shifts, holidays missed, birthdays worked, the whole deal. And like a lot of departments across the country, we have a take-home vehicle policy, which means when my shift ends, the car comes with me, not because it's a perk, but because it cuts response times and keeps a visible police presence in residential areas. I live in a place called Brookstone Meadows, a planned community built in the early 2010s, neat lawns, vinyl fences, kids on scooters, retirees walking dogs at dusk, the kind of place where nothing really happens and people like it that way. The HOA exists mostly to mow common areas and send out the occasional passive-aggressive newsletter about trash cans. I'd been there 5 years without a single issue, and my neighbors knew exactly who I was. They waved when I pulled in, some of them even said they felt safer knowing a patrol car was parked nearby. And then Melissa showed up. Again, not her real name, but if you've ever dealt with an HOA tyrant, you already know her personality type. She moved in about 3 houses down, late 40s, always impeccably dressed, clipboard energy even when she wasn't holding one. And within weeks, she started complaining about everything. Kids too loud, dogs barking too early, boats in driveways, work vans parked overnight, the kind of person who doesn't just want rules, but wants to be the one enforcing them. At first, I barely noticed, until one morning I walked out to my patrol car and saw a folded note tucked under the wiper blade. Bright white paper, neatly written. Commercial vehicles are prohibited from being parked in residential driveways per HOA regulations. Please remove this vehicle immediately. No name, no signature, just that tone, that assumption of authority. I remember actually laughing a little, shaking my head, because a marked police cruiser isn't a commercial vehicle. It's a government emergency vehicle, and those are almost always explicitly exempt from HOA restrictions under both HOA bylaws and state law. I crumpled the note, tossed it, went about my day. A week later, there was another note. Same handwriting, same paper, but the tone had shifted, sharper now. Final warning. Failure to remove commercial vehicle will result in towing. That one got my attention, not because I thought it was valid, but because it showed intent. So I did the responsible thing. I called the HOA management company, spoke to the community manager, a guy named Paul, calm, professional, clearly exhausted from dealing with resident drama. I explained the situation. He confirmed exactly what I already knew. Police vehicles are not commercial vehicles. They're exempt. You're allowed to park it there. And he even added, almost apologetically, that a new resident had been very vocal about enforcement issues, but that she had been informed of the exemption and told she had no authority to take action. That should have been the end of it. According to standard procedure, once the HOA management clarifies an issue, residents back off, because at that point, it's no longer a gray area, it's settled. I assumed Melissa would grumble, maybe glare when she drove past, and move on to her next crusade. I was wrong. The night before everything went sideways, I worked an overnight shift, got home just after sunrise, parked the cruiser in my driveway like I had hundreds of times before, went inside, showered, collapsed into bed. When I woke up mid-afternoon, groggy, disoriented, the house quiet, I glanced out the front window out of habit, and that's when my brain hit a wall. No car, no lights, no decals, just empty space. I thought maybe the department had swapped vehicles for maintenance, which does happen occasionally, but there's always a call, a text, a paper trail. I checked my phone, nothing. I stepped outside, scanned the street, half expecting to see it parked somewhere else. Maybe I'd misremembered, Maybe I was still half asleep, but no, it was gone. I called my supervisor. Hey, did someone pick up my unit? Silence on the other end. Then, no, why? I told him it wasn't in my driveway. His tone changed instantly. Stand by. 5 minutes later, he called back. Your vehicle was towed at 11:17 this morning. Private tow. Requested by an HOA representative. That's the moment the confusion turned into something colder, heavier. A marked police vehicle had been removed from private property without authorization. That's not an HOA dispute. That's a crime. I drove to the tow yard in my personal car, heart pounding, rehearsing the conversation in my head. The manager met me at the gate, middle-aged, sweat-stained polo, the look of a man who's dealt with angry people all day but hadn't yet realized what kind of day this was about to become. I identified myself, told him my patrol car was inside, explained it had been taken without authorization. He shrugged, said they received a call from the HOA president about an illegally parked commercial vehicle. I asked if he'd verified her authority or even bothered to identify what kind of vehicle it was. He admitted they hadn't. They just sent the truck. He told me I could get the car back after paying the tow and storage fees. That's when I stopped being polite. I explained, very clearly, that he was currently in possession of stolen city property, that the vehicle was worth tens of thousands of dollars, and that if it wasn't released immediately, this conversation would escalate fast. He made a call, his face drained of color, and within minutes, the gate opened and my patrol car rolled back out, scratched, damaged, humiliated, but returned. When I parked it back in my driveway, the irony wasn't lost on me. The same spot it had been illegally parked in that morning. And as I documented the damage and called my supervisor to update him, one thing was already clear: Melissa hadn't just crossed a line, she'd sprinted past it, and she had no idea what was about to come next. All right, pause the story right here, because this is where a lot of people get tripped up, and honestly, this is where Melissa got herself in real trouble. According to standard procedure in most HOA-governed communities, enforcement power doesn't live with individual residents. Even if they slap the title board president on themselves, real authority flows through documented bylaws, management companies, and written notices, not emotions, not personal vendettas, and definitely not anonymous windshield notes. From a legal perspective, an HOA can't just tow vehicles on a whim, especially not from private driveways, and especially not when the vehicle in question is a government-owned emergency vehicle clearly exempt under both HOA rules and state statutes. This is a psychological trap a lot of HOA enforcers fall into, the illusion of delegated power. They start believing that because they can complain, they can command, and once someone tells them no, that boundary doesn't register as law, it registers as disrespect. In Melissa's case, being told explicitly by management that she had no authority didn't stop her, it challenged her identity, and that's dangerous, because when ego replaces procedure, people escalate instead of backing down. And here's the quiet part nobody likes to admit. Calling a tow company isn't a neutral act, it's initiating a chain of force. You're asking a third party to seize property, remove it, and hold it for ransom. Legally speaking, that's not enforcement, that's deprivation of property. And when you do that without authority, intent starts to matter a lot. By the next morning, this wasn't my problem anymore. It had officially become the department's problem, and when something crosses that line, the tone changes fast. I was called into headquarters, sat across from the chief and a captain I'd known for years, the kind of room where nobody raises their voice because they don't have to. I laid everything out: the notes, the call with the HOA manager, the tow yard interaction, the damage to the vehicle. And as I talked, I could see the chief's jaw tighten, not dramatically, just enough to let me know exactly how seriously he was taking this. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask leading questions. He waited until I finished, then leaned back and said, calmly, "So someone knowingly ordered a marked patrol vehicle removed from an officer's residence after being told she had no authority to do so?" I nodded. He turned to the captain. "That's theft of city property." No hesitation. No debate. The meeting ended with one instruction: open an investigation. A detective was assigned that same afternoon. He started where these things always start: paper trails and phone records. The towing company's dispatch logs showed a call placed mid-morning, recorded, timestamped. The caller identifying herself as the HOA president, claiming an illegally parked commercial vehicle was in violation and needed immediate removal. No ambiguity. No misunderstanding. She didn't ask a question. She gave an order. The detective then contacted the HOA management company. The manager confirmed, in writing, that Melissa had been told police vehicles were exempt, that she had no authority to order a tow, and that enforcement actions had to go through management, not individual board members. That single email did a lot of heavy lifting because it erased any argument that this was a mistake or a misunderstanding. It showed knowledge, and knowledge changes everything. 3 days after my car disappeared, 2 officers knocked on Melissa's door. I wasn't there. I was working a day shift, but I got a full rundown later, and honestly, I could picture it without trying too hard. She answered confidently at first, polite smile, arms crossed, already irritated that someone dared knock during her afternoon. The detective introduced himself, explained they were investigating a vehicle tow from earlier in the week, and asked if she'd made the call. She didn't deny it. She justified it. She said the vehicle was violating HOA rules, that commercial vehicles weren't allowed, that she was enforcing community standards. When the detective asked if she knew it was a police car, she said it didn't matter. When he asked if she'd been told she had no authority, she hesitated, then tried to pivot, saying she believed her role gave her discretion. That's when the conversation shifted. He explained, slowly, clearly, that a police cruiser isn't a commercial vehicle, that it's city-owned property, that ordering its removal without authorization constituted theft, and that the vehicle had sustained damage as a result. According to standard procedure, once intent and value are established, charges aren't optional, they're mandatory. When he cited the statute, when he explained the value threshold, when he said the word felony, the confidence drained out of her face. She tried to walk it back. She said she didn't steal anything. She just made a call. From a legal perspective, that distinction doesn't hold. Causing property to be taken is the same as taking it yourself. She'd initiated the chain of events, knowing she wasn't allowed to, and that made her responsible for every consequence that followed. She was arrested on the spot. Handcuffs, patrol car, neighbors peeking through blinds, the whole scene playing out on the same quiet street she'd been trying to control. The charge was felony theft of government property, based on the vehicle's value. Her attorney tried to frame it as an overreach, an honest mistake, a misunderstanding of HOA authority, but the evidence didn't cooperate. The recorded tow request, the HOA email warning her explicitly, the exemption language in the bylaws, the damage report. The prosecution didn't have to embellish anything. They just had to lay it out in order. In court, the prosecutor was blunt. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional disregard for clear boundaries, driven by a desire to assert control. The fact that it interfered with a police officer's ability to respond to emergencies didn't help her case either. That argument landed hard. Juries understand inconvenience. They don't tolerate risk to public safety. Faced with that reality, Melissa took a plea deal. The felony charge was reduced, but the consequences were still real. Jail time, probation, restitution for the vehicle damage and towing costs, fines, community service. The sentence wasn't symbolic. It was disruptive. It changed her life in ways she hadn't anticipated when she picked up the phone to teach someone a lesson. The HOA board moved quickly once the arrest became public. They removed her from any leadership role, issued a written apology to me and to the department, and sent out a notice clarifying enforcement procedures and exemptions, the kind of document that exists mostly to prevent exactly this kind of situation from ever happening again. A new board president was elected, a retired first responder, someone who understood both authority and restraint, and he came by personally to apologize, not because he had to, but because he thought it mattered. Melissa served part of her sentence, was released on probation, and within weeks, her house went up for sale. She didn't attend HOA meetings anymore. She didn't leave notes on windshields. Eventually, she left the state entirely. The neighborhood went back to being quiet, not because it was controlled, but because the tension was gone. As for the tow company, the city reviewed their practices. They weren't criminally charged, but they lost their contract rotation for failing to verify authority before towing a clearly marked government vehicle. That's how accountability is supposed to work, not scorched earth, but correction with consequences. And me, I kept parking my patrol car in the driveway. Same spot, same routine, A few new scratches underneath as a reminder that escalation doesn't always look dramatic at first. Sometimes it starts with a folded note and a belief that rules exist to serve your ego. By the time everything's settled, paperwork filed, contracts reviewed, new names on the HOA letterhead, the neighborhood felt normal again, but not in the way it had before. It was quieter, sure, but it was also a little more honest. People stopped assuming that authority came from confidence alone. They started asking questions instead of making demands. And that's really where this story lands. Not on the arrest, not on the sentence, but on the lesson underneath it all. The lesson here is that rules without restraint turn into weapons. HOAs exist to manage shared spaces, not to satisfy personal grudges or power fantasies. And when someone mistakes proximity to authority for actual authority, they don't just create conflict, they create liability. Melissa didn't wake up one morning planning to commit a felony. She woke up wanting control, and she convinced herself that the ends justified the means, that making a phone call was harmless, that someone else would bear the responsibility. That belief is incredibly common, and it's why situations like this keep happening. From a legal perspective, this case is a textbook example of why intent matters more than intent to harm. She didn't need to want to hurt anyone. She only needed to know she wasn't allowed to do what she did and do it anyway. That's the line the law cares about. Causing property to be seized, moved, and damaged doesn't become legal just because you weren't the one holding the tow hook. The law looks at causation, not vibes. There's also a psychological piece here that's worth sitting with for a second. This is a psychological trap people fall into when they feel powerless in other areas of their life. They latch onto a narrow lane where they're allowed to say no, and they guard it aggressively because it becomes part of their identity. When someone challenges that lane, even politely, it doesn't feel like disagreement, it feels like disrespect, and that's when escalation feels justified in their mind. They stop seeing people. They start seeing obstacles. For anyone living in an HOA, whether you love it or hate it, the takeaway is simple. Understand the scope of your authority, and if you don't have it, don't borrow it. Enforcement is a process, not a mood. If you're a board member, your job isn't to win. It's to follow procedure even when you're annoyed. Especially when you're annoyed. And for law enforcement officers, firefighters, EMS, or anyone with a take-home vehicle, this story is a reminder that visibility cuts both ways. Most communities appreciate it. A few resent it. If you're facing pushback, document everything. Involve management early, and don't assume common sense will save you. It won't. Paper trails will. What stuck with me most wasn't the arrest or the courtroom. It was how fast a quiet neighborhood turned into a legal case because one person refused to accept no as a complete sentence. Control feels good until it costs you something real. Freedom, money, reputation. Sometimes all three. So if you're watching this and thinking about that note you almost left on someone's windshield, or that call you were about to make to teach them a lesson, pause. Ask yourself whether you're enforcing a rule or feeding an ego. Because the line between those two things is thinner than people think, and once you cross it, you don't get to decide how far the consequences go. If you've ever dealt with an HOA dispute that spiraled out of control, or you've seen someone's power trip backfire in spectacular fashion, share your story. These conversations matter, because the more people understand where authority actually comes from, the less likely they are to misuse it. And if you want more stories where ordinary decisions collide with real-world consequences, you know what to do.